Welcome everybody, good evening, and welcome to the Fifth Estate at the Wheeler Centre. I'm Sally Warhaft, and tonight we're discussing the media in Australia at a time of unprecedented upheaval and confusion, some bitterness and incredibly rapid change. To help us understand what's happening in our media landscape and how we might best ensure the future careful monitoring of this country, we have here an esteemed panel, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large for The Australian and formerly, of course, Editor-in-Chief from 1991 to 1996. Paul has worked also in various senior roles for Fairfax. He is the best-selling author of many books, including The Dismissal, The Hawke Ascendancy, The End of Certainty, and most recently, The March of Patriots. And we're very grateful that you travelled from Sydney to be with us tonight, Paul. Thank you. Andrew Jaspan is the founder and editor of The Conversation and a former editor of the London Observer, The Scotsman, The Sun Herald and the London edition of The Big Issue in the UK. He was, of course, also the editor-in-chief of The Age from 2004 to 2008. And Harold Mitchell is Australia's biggest ad buyer. He's the founder of Mitchell and Partners and the executive chairman of Aegis Media Pacific. And I'd need the full hour to list his board appointments and chairs, and it's probably safe to say there's not a gallery or museum or symphony orchestra that he hasn't played some part in. So please welcome these three gentlemen tonight. I'm going to start by asking each of you a different question. Paul Kelly, there's been a massive secular shift in media and newspaper culture and in the business of media that's been going on for at least a decade, probably more, but some really significant self-inflicted wounds as well. Some that perhaps could have been avoided if newspapers had been as vigilant about investigating themselves as they have been in the past about investigating others. What happened in our media newspaper culture for these things to have been missed, for these self-inflicted wounds to have happened? And what were the early signs you might have seen when you were actually editor-in-chief in the early to mid-90s of our national broadsheet?
Well, I didn't see any signs then. I wouldn't put myself forward as anyone who was able to predict the revolution that we now see. It's a difficult and probing question you've asked. To what extent we're our own worst enemy? Where did we go wrong ourselves? And I think it's always easy to look back in retrospect. And of course it involves a commentary about different companies. Different companies have responded in different ways, and that reflects their own culture, it reflects the quality of their own leadership. I think as far as news is concerned, obviously, we've been part of a global assessment triggered always by Rupert Murdoch in terms of how he sees the company, in terms of how he's wanted to push the boundaries. In this country, of course, it's been a very heavily orientated newspaper company. I think overall we're in a reasonably good position now under the leadership of Kim Williams. I think, and I've said in print, that I feel that Fairfax responded too late, that Fairfax responded in a quite belated way to the magnitude of these challenges, but I think that reflects internal issues as far as Fairfax are concerned. Taking an historical perspective, my own view of the Fairfax company is the turning point was in the late 1980s with the failed privatisation attempt by young Warwick, and I think that was the fundamental change in the nature of that company.
Andrew Jaspan, Fairfax, of course, has copped the most stick for its failures and is probably in the deeper trouble. Paul Keating recently described the Sydney Morning Herald as a complete rag lost in space. How did this happen, and what did you do to try and stop it when you're at the helm of The Age?
Well, look, let me start off by saying I think your assessment, Paul, is pretty much on the money, with one exception, that I think the real problems have been one of shocking management, poor stewardship at the top, managers driven by managers who, by the way, knew nothing about newspapers. Nothing, and let's. I just want to start off by saying we should stop using the word newspapers. We should just talk about journalism, because it was just the cheapest way to distribute journalism through newspapers, the penny press. You know, frankly, the cheapest way to do it now is through digital. So we need to really talk about a shocking management of journalistic enterprises by people whose background was either running management consultancies or printing presses or rugby teams or whatever. They do not have real knowledge of the business, unlike his boss, Rupert Murdoch, who has, always had a phrase that's used, ink in their veins, coursing through their body. So you make mistakes when you don't really understand that journalism is a people business. It's fundamentally, it's about attracting the best journalists, having your very clear vision about what you're about how you differentiate your journalism to others. And the last point I wanted to make is the other problem is that newspapers are driven by short-term greed and profits in this country, where Australia, the rest of the world was going through the crisis. And when we talk about we didn't know this was coming, this has been coming a long time. Anybody, as you said in your opening comments, who did their investigations into what was going on knew this was all coming. But because there was so much money sloshing around here with mega profits, people just thought, well, as long as we can continue earning our bonuses, our big salaries, we can keep the shareholders and the media analysts happy, and he keeps putting his ads into our papers, we're okay. We can escape Armageddon Day. And that's what's come now, but it's actually all been predicted. It was in the book.
Well, I think the only money still swirling around might be going into Harold's pocket and not many others. I wonder, Harold, what should have been foreseen, and how can newspapers, journalism, recover from this pall of doom that's around them? How on earth do you sell an institution like
Let me
Fairfax?
cut it short. It can't. I just love editors when they turn feral. Good on you. You think it's all over for them. I love Andrew. We have wonderful times together. Let me put it in some context. This is the biggest change that has happened in our lifetime, but quite probably since the beginning of the printing press. That sounds a bit grand, but what's happening is this: that there was a time when if you wanted to have information distributed, you walked down the street and you told someone. Before the printing press came along, what that did, it started the method of distribution. You could tell more people than one at a time. And so the various iterations of that over time, what really happened was it was printed in different forms. It became magazines. Distribution had started more than one-on-one. And so mass media was well underway. In the late 20s and early 30s in this country, radio, commercial and state-owned happened, followed in the 50s, 56 in this city with television, black and white and then colour. But in 2000, the biggest change that happened, we were talking about mass media, mass products, mass markets. It was mass media in whatever form that it was, and journalism and such like was all just part of it. In 2000, the digital world had arrived, and that was the biggest change that ever happened. 1 year before that or so, Google had started. Rupert Murdoch had said it wouldn't work, and to his very great credit, in I think an editors' conference in March 2003, said he was wrong, and he hit it off an entirely new course. And I agree with what Andrew is saying about that. So what we're dealing with here now is the biggest change, where now people, instead of being mass markets like we've got in this room now like this, you well know that you can be talking to people one at a time. Now, the other thing about the media previously was that it went one way. That if you sat down and you watched television, the news tonight, you watched it, and if you wanted to do something about it, you picked up the phone, you went to the shop, you got the catalogue. But the digital world meant that there was two ways. that you could press a button, you could do something, and on your phone, your iPad or whatever, it'd be different like that. And what we're seeing here from the two gentlemen on my right, they've lived through it, they've been exceptional, they've been on top of it. In both their cases, I know they've moved on and in every way, is that they understand this biggest change. We've got a business which did change in 2000. It was one business that used to buy television, radio, newspapers. Progressively during the last decade, we started the first digital business in this country, which is now still the biggest in 2000, because I could see that was a change that was coming. But now we've got 26 different companies, and those 26 different companies reflect everything that there is about the media business now. Now, the big media organisations have had a battle. They're big ships. How do you turn them quickly? But they have to turn. And right now, every day, by the way, I wouldn't worry too much about the change. I lived through the time when every media organisation here changed except one. So that's the context of what we are, the biggest change in probably history.
Can I just come in? Harold, I think most of that is absolutely right. One fact, though, is 1995 that the internet really went global. And The Age actually started their online site in 1995. So we've had almost 20 years of knowing this was coming, but a complete failure really to work through the strategic implications of that. Sorry, I was just going to make one other
let me
quick...
shut you up. Away you go.
Yeah. No, just one other point.
Sally's running it, but...
I'm going to take it back after this point too.
I just wanted to say that what's underpinned everything you've said, and it was a really good commentary, is advertising.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the real issue here, Sally, is that when we started off, if you take The Age here, it was the monopoly newspaper in the city. All the advertising just really got the bulk of the advertising. What's happened in the last 20 years is the enormous explosion of new media, new channels, and I don't just mean online, I mean outdoor advertising, radio, all the television channels. So the advertising dollar doesn't grow exponentially, it just gets cut up across lots of different platforms, and what happens is you get less and less of it. So whereas the advertising age had a huge pile which allowed them to employ a huge number of journalists, that shrunk, and now we see the problems. And the problems really, as I say, is this business has always been, largely speaking, with the exception of the ABC that we'll come on to, has been about an advertising crisis.
What about content, though? Because Fairfax CEO Greg Highwood recently told Neil Mitchell that the drop in circulation at Fairfax had absolutely nothing to do with content. Now, Harold, Andrew, each of you really, how would a response like that go in any other business or in politics? Does content just not matter?
Oh, absolutely. And content will be the complete key to the future, the content, what it is all about. Pick up on just one point here about advertising, which it's absolutely true, because this Australia has the highest per capita advertising spend in the world, less than 1% of the world's population. We have 5% of the world's advertising. But when The Age started to give the paper away for nothing in 1995, or the content, not the paper, it commenced a real problem, because in the end, nothing is for nothing, as somebody once said. And so advertising, what's happened? Right now, digital advertising is just on 20% of all advertising. That's happened in just 12 years. That's the biggest change that's ever happened. It took television twice as long as that, and that was a dramatic change. So that's a very big thing that's happened, and that's why, as Paul rightly observes, these changes are taking place now, which were underway because suddenly the advertising has moved so quickly that within 2 years it will be approaching 30% of all advertising. It will have replaced television as number one, as newspapers as number one, which will come from 40% down to around 20%, and television from 32% to around 20%. So that has suddenly made these financial businesses, which they also are, that. But I say there is a real future, because what happens in this country, every day people spend on average 8 hours a day with the media. You say, surely not. They do, I promise you. That's my whole lifetime in the advertising, and the media will, 8 hours a day. But it has changed now to a point where the digital world is pinching 2 hours of it, and that's come off everything else. As for The Age, I wouldn't worry about The Age. More than 50% of The Age readers tonight will be reading it online. So the paper is still there, the paper is still important, but not as a paper. It's the content which is key.
Paul, the demise of Fairfax, the way we talk about it reminds me of the government, the way we talk about the government, where there's been this failure to connect a dumbing down of their product to a loss of support, where there's a sort of a default option to just keep stripping it down in response. There's no leadership, there's no thinking about structural weaknesses that have been there for a long, long time, and no real courage. Does this seem coincidental to you, or is there something deeper in our culture between media, politics, that's kind of connecting these things? And what effect does it have on policy, public policy? Well,
look, let me start out with a sort of broad response to that. I think it's easy to get mesmerised when you listen to this sort of discussion. And one of the questions here is, what does it mean? What are the priorities? Essentially, what's required now is the capacity to manage several issues simultaneously. What are those issues? I nominate 4 in particular, 4 above all. The first one is to manage the cultural change. And essentially what this means is being able to participate in the digital world, understand what it means, absorb it, yet also participate in traditional forms of media as well, being able to play the old game and the new game, being able to follow the cultural trends, master them and read them. Now that is difficult for a particular individual. It's even more challenging for a media organisation. That's the first requirement. The second requirement is to cut costs. This is the bottom line imperative driving virtually all media organisations in the world these days. So you've got to have those reductions in editorial budgets, and what's quite fundamental is how they're done, the way they're implemented, and the values that those cost reductions imply. The third thing is to find new revenue sources, generate new revenue from the digital age. And this is, of course, the great challenge in terms of the business model, how we get new sources of revenue. If we don't get new sources of revenue, we're finished. And the fourth challenge, I think, is essentially to keep one's nerve, to have faith in what you're talking about, Sally, the importance of ongoing professional journalism, because people are better educated than ever before. They still want quality information. They'll want quality information across different sources of platforms. So it's important to keep the faith in terms of the conviction and confidence in the ongoing requirements of journalism. I think they're the big 4 tasks. Now, I don't want to get too involved here beating up on Fairfax. Seeing I work for the rival company, I think, as I said earlier on, Fairfax have made some very, very substantial blunders, as Andrew has pointed out. And I think the industry, in particular Fairfax, should have got onto all this much earlier, but that company has been bedevilled, I think, by weak leadership for a long period of time, and again, as Andrew said, by leaders who did not understand the nature of the industry, and that is a disaster.
News Limited, of course, has very strong leadership in Rupert Murdoch, and somebody who believes in newspapers. I mean, News Limited in Australia and the Australian have come under sustained attack from the government, from individuals. You can't kind of win, can you? There's either no leadership or strong leadership that's sort of pulverised. How do you respond to that, Paul?
Well, there are a couple of fundamental points here. What's happening with newspapers, what's happening with traditional media in the digital world, in the fragmented media world we now live in, brand becomes more important than ever. So if you look at the way British newspapers have been evolving for quite some time, you look at the way Australian newspapers have been evolving, they define themselves by campaigning journalism, and they define themselves very distinctly in the political marketplace. Now, this trend is going to be accentuated. There's no question about this at all. So essentially, part of the commercial strategy of the media is to use a political position to reinforce brand loyalty. So that is central to the editorial culture of the paper and the commercial strategy of the paper. I think one of the problems with Fairfax is that they've actually got these things fighting one another. But I think this is important because it raises a question for the politicians. Now, what we see on the part of the politicians today is we have a national Labor government in which the Labor Party is undergoing a profound crisis of identity. I think Labor is undergoing a very significant historical crisis, and it's not at all clear to me that Labor will be able to emerge successfully from the tribulations it now faces. So essentially what we see on the part of the Labor Party, particularly when it comes to, say, something like the Finkelstein inquiry, I see that being motivated 100% by politics, 100% by Labor's political difficulties and Labor's resentment towards the media, and in particular its resentment towards News Limited and the News Limited papers, in particular the News Limited tabloid papers, and the way they are branding themselves in this digital age, the way they are establishing their identity and trying to succeed in this age, and part of that is through political positioning to reinforce brand loyalty. So if that makes sense, I think that is a sort of a glimpse about the bigger picture. And you see at the moment, I think, tremendous tensions between the government and the media, probably the greatest I've seen in my lifetime as a professional journalist over 40 years, and I've seen a lot of pretty antagonistic situations. I think this is the worst. And one of the fundamental questions is, where are we going and what comes out of this? We're talking about the difficulties the media industry faces. Well, what has the government got in store for the industry? Is the government going to make the industry's transition easier or more difficult? A really fundamental question.
Harold and Andrew as well, I'd like your response to that.
Well, I just want to start off with something which I think is quite interesting, which is that we must never forget that in Australia there is a very poor choice in terms of diversity of the media. It's not like I worked in London and I worked in Scotland, and every day you could pick up a dozen different outlets in terms of newspapers, and then you had even more radio, TV, etc. You've got here, we're blessed in Melbourne with having two Melbourne papers, and obviously the Australian sells here in Melbourne as well, in Sydney as well too. If you live in the other capital cities in this country, state capitals, there's just one. When we talk about the Australian, what's really interesting about the Australian, and by the way, Paul, I think your assessment was spot on, but here's the thing, the Australian is a subsidised newspaper. It's never made money.
That's wrong. That is an urban myth. I don't want to interrupt, but the paper,
is it a rural myth?
Paper has made.
You already have.
The paper has made quite substantial profits a lot of the last 20 years.
Every time the editor, Chris Mitchell, is asked, he says he doesn't want to reveal it. But I think in terms of transparency, we should be told how much money it makes or loses. My understanding is, and it may well be an urban myth amongst the rural myth amongst the, whatever. But the point is, my understanding is it's made very little money, if any at all. So you have a paper which, in a sense, is telling us how we should put our ship in order, which has never actually made really substantial money in the way that, for example, The Age does. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second thing is... I
can't... The Age... making money.
No, sorry, it did. Yeah, it did. Now, I think right now, and Harold...
In your years...
Harold is... I mean, when I came here in 2004, I just want to get this on the record. No, it's nothing to do with me, Harold, honestly. Nothing to do... It was making, when I arrived, 100 million a year. That was in 2004. Now, it's hardly making any money now, and that's the scale of the crisis. It really is an enormous crisis. If you rip out $100 million... And it then leads to an actually much more interesting question, which is this, because you talked about content. Does content matter? We used to do a lot of surveys into why people read The Age. 20% of them read The Age for the ads. They didn't read it for the content. They didn't read it for the leaders, the columnists, for Michelle Grattan. They read it because they wanted to find out about jobs, homes, and cars, right? And coming back to what I said earlier, instead of actually understanding that was the case, seeing the digital world come along and actually provide digital platforms for that, they just lost that business. So when you lose all that business, 20% of the reason that people come into the paper go, so you lose 20% of your audience. And so it went on, and Seek took all the recruitment, and you know the others as well, Harold.
Yeah, well, I've actually forgotten the question, so let me give you an answer. I'll give you an answer anyway about something else. It's fascinating and wonderful to us all senior folk here talking about senior things and senior moments, because that's exactly what's happened. This talking about newspapers, and I grew up as an office boy at an advertising agency one block from here, and I remember as a very young person, Paul and Andrew, you wouldn't understand, but at 5 to 6, or no, 5:30, because there was something called 6 o'clock closing. Who remembers 6 o'clock closing here? Yes, yeah, I thought so. Yes, that defines the market, doesn't it? Well, it was a long, long time. You didn't have it in Sydney, did you?
Of course we did.
Of course you did. You have everything we've got. Well, what happened, the reason for the story, there was a pub on the corner over here, and this was police rounds up here because of the D24, Russell Street and the police, and all the newspapers got on so well that the people that did police rounds, I've got to tell you, they were the most amazing, incredible journalists of all time. They had names like Harry the Horse, Fred the Needle. Do you remember these people? They were colourful characters, but they were incredible journalists who would go and dig out a story, and that was so important and such a big thing. They were amazing, and having drunk 6 beers in about 4 minutes, they would then phone the story through to someone at the other end, wherever it was, and the next day I would see the crispest, best lot of 300 words you'd ever seen. One point about that the content was absolutely clear and critical. That's the case. But the other thing is that this has moved on from what it was about newspapers. I can tell you one thing. These things here, oops, the rock's the back of it. These things here, there are now 24 million of them in this country, and growing like you wouldn't believe, enabled with so much. Well, our business, advertising driven, of course, but we need to understand what people are all about. And what people are about, they will now get the information that they want in the shortest possible time that they ever can, in an effort to try and keep fit. Marty, the trainer who looks after me, he said, "Yeah, I saw that all on the television." I said, "What do you mean you watch it? You don't read the newspaper?" No. I saw it on the television. Whereabouts on the television? You know those crawly bits underneath the breakfast show? I get all the news on that. Well, when you think about it, America bombs Iraq. How many words does it take? And that's all that he really needs. And so the world has changed dramatically, and that was the point that I was making before. I've said to members of the government, Paul would know all of this too, and I thought we'd been through some big crisis. I have too, of seeing governments and newspapers really argue with each other. But it's true. Right now, I was talking to a very senior man in the government who was going on about Finkelstein. For those that don't know, Finkelstein is a way through an inquiry to try and absolutely close down the independence of journalism, which is a very bad thing in this country if it was to happen. That would be wrong. I don't think it'll get there. There'll be a bit of fiddling around the edges. But I've said to the man in the government, don't worry about what the Australian writes. I mean, I'm sorry about that, Paul, but worry about what might appear in the Geelong Advertiser. Because if the Geelong Advertiser picks on you, Richard Marles, the member down there, might well lose his seat. And that's the importance of it. The media is now bigger than just the newspapers. The newspapers, they were the past. And we lived through that, and Andrew was there grand times. What did they do? They lost their way of making money, which was the real estate, the cars and everything, and they just lost it. Fairfax had the chance to do it, and that was subsidising, quite probably for the last quarter of a century at the very least, what it was, and was hiding the fact that underneath of this incredible revolution was taking place. It's underway, it's changed, and right now it's very exciting because we don't know where it's going into the future, but ask any little five-year-old what it is that's going to drive them, and it won't be newspapers. They can still read, they can read brilliantly, they're wonderful. They learnt another language. Who knows about these texting things? We're all spelling different things things like that. And that's the real thing. But the point of it, coming back to one thing, that pub on the corner in 1959 when I first went there, that is still critical. It's about the information and what it is and what the government and anyone else in power, wherever it might be, can't run away from is ideas. What we are talking about is how those ideas are distributed. And that train has moved on, right? And I'll tell you the other thing about the world. I was just thinking about something Paul said before, and the same with Andrew, about I deal with, we're the biggest media buyers in the country. We control over 20% of all the advertising. And it means I have to learn to live with these people that are media owners. And I can tell you one thing, over all the years I've been in the business, I have the greatest respect for, because I see what it works. When you have an owner of the media that acts as an owner, Kerry Packer understood people and acted as an owner. When you have corporations, which is what happened during a period of time with Fairfax, when people came in, they weren't owners of the business now. Whether it's a public company or a private company, the critical thing too is I've swapped an email, would you believe, in the last 24 hours with Rupert Murdoch about something that's happening in England. Because it's a small world.
Do tell.
No. Paul, even Paul knows you don't do things like that.
I want to pick up, if you're right and it's the end of traditional journalism as we know it, and there's all this exciting things coming in to replace it, there's also important things that are going to be lost, and we need to know how they can be reformed. Or now, one of the things you've written about recently, Paul, is political consensus, that when you have major news institutions that over time look seriously at public policy, when you've got Fairfax and the Australian together from different angles and so on, what happens to building public policy, building consensus on important political ideas and other sorts of ideas when that goes?
Well, I think that's right. I think the fragmentation of the media will make governing more difficult. I think that's the central paradigm here. But there's a profound paradox at work at the moment, because if you consider, we've got two competing trends. On the one hand, we're told that the influence of traditional media is weakening. The Age, the Australian, the television networks, whatever. I mean, this is a very powerful conventional wisdom, that we now live in the digital age, an age of multiple voices, a fragmented media, great sense of media pluralism, a sense of individual empowerment. So you've got this sense of pluralism and diversity at work. Yet on the other hand, you have the government proposing and debating, intervening the way the government has never intervened before in terms of regulating the media in this country.
Bad.
So these two trends are fighting one another. If this is true, that we've got more voices and more pluralism, why are we having a serious debate about statutory regulation of the media in this country, the like of which we have never seen before? So I think this is a really important issue to put on the table. Now, in relation to your question, Sally, I think that the politicians are going to find things much more difficult. I think they are already. What we've seen over the last few years has been a very disappointing period of Labor government. When Kevin Rudd came to power in 2007, there was, I think, a very widespread expectation, certainly was my expectation, that this would be a successful period of Labor government. Rudd looked good, a policy wonk, a competent guy, had great public goodwill, was a very good communicator. But several years down the track, it's a very different story. We look at the performance of the Labor Party, we look at the performance of the government, we see this depth of antagonism between the government and the media, and essentially what we see here are multiple forces at work, but one is Labor has had great trouble getting its message through to the country. It's had great difficulty understanding the dynamic forces at work, the forces of media and social change. And I think Labor has misread the nature of these forces, and that's one of the reasons why it has not been nearly as successful a government as what we anticipated. I think it's more difficult for Prime Ministers, for Treasurers, for senior ministers, for cabinets to muster the support for their policies that they used to do in the past. I remember very much being in the gallery when Hawke was Prime Minister, Paul Keating was Treasurer, and Keating was a master media manipulator. But essentially what he did was he relied on about 5 or 6 key people in the media, and he worked them furiously. He'd ring you any time, morning, noon or night, to get out the message. But it's not so easy for the Treasurer to do that these days, because you can't have the same impact going through and selling your message to 5 or 6 people, because it's a more fragmented media marketplace. It's more difficult then to get the message up and out. It's more difficult to govern.
Yeah, you know, there's again, I think that analysis is good, Paul, but here's a flip side. There's actually not just a case of being more fragmentation, there's actually greater concentration of the media than ever before. Harold, you wrote a piece about it, and I do occasionally read your thing.
Thank you so much. I'll keep writing.
This is a private joke because I didn't read one of his columns.
And I put his name in it. Nicely.
But actually, as you said, and it's a point I used to make as well, The Age is now read by more people than ever before.
Really?
It's just not in the newspaper. It's on that machine that he just showed. It's online, etc. So what you've actually got now is more people, whereas you had previously something like, 200 people buying the paper, 200,000 people buying the paper, is now read by 1 million people, not just in Melbourne, but across.
But, will that be true in 6 months' time when it costs you $40 a month to do it?
Well,
if the content's right, it will.
Yeah, well, I think you know the jury's out on that one. But the point I wanted to make really is this: that there is now within both the News Limited papers and the Fairfax papers greater concentration of power than ever before. And not only that, both papers are shedding jobs, because what they want to do is actually come up with a much more federal or national approach towards news, where it'll be produced once and then it'll be distributed elsewhere. So in the case of Fairfax, I'll talk about Fairfax, they'll be combining largely the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age. They'll be producing copy, which will then be distributed on both places. So you won't have, for example, two travel editors or two even possibly political editors or whatever. So that's fine, but here's the twist to all of that, and here's the rub. I think, and I'll say it again now, I think Rupert has built a brilliant business in this country. He's a really good newspaper man. He understands his market. His papers really understand their readers. I think they've done a great job. I think Fairfax, I won't go into it all. It's sort of intruding into private grief in a sense. But at least we had 2 different views. If we end up with the controlling interest of Gina Rinehart, what we'll have is and she has an ambition not to make money out of owning Fairfax. This is not a financial play. Like
you would not possibly be able to think that would be true, would you?
This is not a financial play. This is spare loose change. I mean, she is the richest woman in the world, the richest Australian. She's worth 27 billion. She's literally just a bit of loose change. Has bought it was 18%. She's brought it down to 15% because there are other things she wants to do with her money and her TV interest. But if she gets the ability to control editorially the direction of these papers, because she thinks right now the papers are unbalanced, biased against her interests, and she wants to reposition them so that they actually are more favourable towards her outlook, let's call it that. What you'll have is essentially in both News Limited and in papers which will be largely directed by Gina and her friends, a very similar worldview between the 2 papers. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se, as long as there were lots of other players there. So when we talk about the fact that in the digital age, and by the way, I'm out of newspapers now, in the conversation with just digital, we don't even take advertising, so I'm really out of this world. But I'm just reflecting.
True. I can agree with that.
I'm out of the world we're talking about, Harold.
Love it.
if we actually look at those two players now, if we had lots of other players, and the digital world has got, yes, lots of new players, but they're all tiny. None of them have the impact, the eyeballs, the readers that these two groups have, News Limited and Fairfax. Yeah. They completely dominate. Forget about newspapers. It's your phone, your computer, whatever else. They now have a reach which far exceeds anything we've ever seen in Australia before, and that's the transformation. So I don't want anyone to be taken in that we suddenly have this wonderful plurality of views out there, that suddenly, this is something we never had before due to the digital age. The digital age has actually allowed small minnows to come in, but the big players are bigger than ever and more powerful than ever.
Well, I make 2 points, and I thank Paul for his comments too, in relation to a number of things about the mass media, really, that you could call 5 journalists. I presume, Paul, you were one of them, were you, at that time?
Of course.
I gather that. Of course. The other 4, I think I can imagine. So the power of all of that, and that truly has passed. But by the way, it served us well over a period of time, because it gave us Billy McMahon as Prime Minister. Is that how it happened? No, didn't.
Well, that was Frank Packer.
There you go. That was the power of just a person, and that did show what could happen at the time. But you mentioned, if a government can't sell its policies, you can't blame the media for that. And if the media turns on, if there's a group in power who couldn't sell fresh fish to hungry seals, well, that's it. They shouldn't be there. And so that is probably what might be playing out right now, on one hand. But Keating, of course, was a master of it. I go to England every 4 weeks, a board I sit on, where it's not as if I don't trust the English, but there you go, I've got to be there. And I don't take any clothes. I leave them in a hotel there. I feel like Humphrey Bogart. So I only take one bag. And last time I took Paul Keating's book of speeches, which was a wonderful book. I couldn't fit it in to bring back, so I tore out 2 pages only. The first one was about Asia. 1998, he gave a speech where the collapse, some you recall, 97, melt of Asia. We must engage with Asia at our peril. And of course, he was so right. It'll soon be 50% of the world's economy. But the second one was about leadership. And so I don't know if we need to confuse newspapers where they are with the government. But he said about leadership, there are only 2 elements that are important in leadership. One is imagination, and that's true. Hawke, Keating, others imagined what Australia could be. It could be great, it could be doing. But the second thing is so critical and important, which is what must go with imagination, which is courage. And in fact, if you don't have the courage to be a leader, you'll never be a leader, and the media will catch you out. So I make that point about the past is the past. That's where it was, and it was magnificent at what it was.
You better turn your phone off tonight, Harold, because I reckon Paul will be wanting to know what you did with the other 4,000 pages.
Comrade, what do you mean? What
go mental.
Yeah, I will read it. Yeah, but that was great. But the point about the phone is that back to what Paul was saying about how do you now get the message out, if you like. Yes, you can. Let me tell you one thing about those words about Obama. How did Obama become president, and will probably do it again? He raised more money than the best of the Republican fundraisers ever. The Clintons, they were just brilliant at it, and they might have got $200 to $300 million that time. Well, he raised last time $750 million for his campaign, and he's well on track right now to raise $1 billion, and he will do it. And he did it with these things. And so he was able to phone everybody with a message, and the phone would go and it would work like that. He grabbed hold of it, and Commerce is now doing the same thing. You know about people that buy stuff overseas and what they do, and the whole world of the digital world. And so there are ways, if you're clever about it, of what to do, of how now you can speak to everybody as an individual. And so that's the key of what it is. And so what we're living through here is change. And I'm sure this probably happened when the first car came along and someone felt it was so scary that they walked in front of it with a red flag, which is what they did, because you couldn't trust this thing. That's all that we're doing through. We're living through the biggest change in history of distribution, not of ideas. They will always be the greatest thing that ever has to happen. But the fools will be caught out. If there is a journalist who's writing rubbish, which just fills up the newspaper, I write a piece for papers, a bit of a hobby, I like doing it. And I said to one fellow, half the stuff we put in here is rubbish. He says, well, I've got to fill the page. I said, well, that's stupid. Why don't we just cut the page down and put in good stuff? And that will now be caught out, and that'll be the difference of it we are simply living, Sally, through the biggest change we've ever seen. Understandable completely. I think the big media companies will probably live on, but because they tend to over a period of time. We haven't seen, I think in the 60 years in the world, we might have only ever seen two new media companies. One was News around the world, and the second was Google. And we skip over Google tonight, but one of our biggest influences of what we do in our business, we're Google's biggest customer. They've changed the world. Apple have done the same thing. But ideas will be important. The distribution method is simply what's changing.
Paul, I wonder if you want to respond to, well, particularly the comments Andrew made about Gina Rinehart and concentration.
I'd like to. What's really important in the old media world and the new media world is branding. And I appreciate the point Andrew is making about Gina Rinehart, but the idea that you can reposition fundamentally products like The Age and Sydney Morning Herald and take them from their current political position in the marketplace and turn them into some, whatever it is, pro-mining, pro-Bjelke-Petersen, pro-Gina Rinehart, far-right position is, I mean, that won't happen. That won't happen because in the marketplace you can't fulfil that sort of transformation. I think reader loyalty and expectations about the product, about these products, are quite deep-seated. And I've got no doubt at all that there would be a consumer revolt if Gina Rinehart attempted to do this. So I think one's got to be alert to not just the power of so-called media moguls, if you like, but the limitations on their power as well. I mean, if you look at a paper like The Australian, I mean, fundamental to our success is our brand, and our brand is now very deeply established. That is, we stand for certain things, we stand for certain values, we approach news through this perspective, and I think that there's an awareness about what the paper stands for across the country. We are the national paper. We are the national paper looking at the country from Hobart to Victoria to North Queensland to WA, and that means you've got to bring a particular perspective to it, a particular brand to it. So I think this point is really fundamental.
We're going to be asking for your questions in a moment, so put your hand up if you'd like to ask someone on the panel a question, and someone with a microphone will come to you. Pretty blokey business this, isn't it? Media is meant to be at the forefront of change and social debate and so on, and I know there are incredibly brilliant female journalists all over the shop, but they're not in the kind of roles that are actually making the big decisions, and that those decisions about who hires and fires editors, who has the money.
Pick on these blokes, not me.
Well,
doesn't happen in our place.
How can the media be so far behind everyone else?
Look, first of all, it's a good question. Secondly, I appointed Gay Alcorn to be the Sunday Age editor.
I'm not talking about editors. There have been some terrific female editors.
Okay. Well, let me talk to you.
That. I'm talking about power.
Okay. Well, let me tell you, I edited the Observer newspaper in London, as you said. That was run by Carolyn McCall, one of the best CEOs I've ever come across, with a fantastic understanding of the marketplace. Now, she ran The Guardian and the Observer. Now, they don't actually make money. They're cross-subsidised as well. But they have now got the 5th largest reach into the US of any news site. They're the 2nd biggest in the UK, only pipped by the Mail on Sunday, which is really kind of celebrity and gossip focused. They've got amazing brands, led by Carolyn Marland and Carolyn McCall. I worked for The Big Issue, which was led by Anita Roddick, who had an amazing sort of.
So that's my point. What's going on in Australia?
Well, I don't know, but we have some of our banks run by women.
Our country is run by women.
Our country is run by women. In terms of newspapers, the short answer to that is that I think particularly when it comes to newspapers, These are incredibly demanding jobs, and I'm not sure that people everybody necessarily...
Ooh, trouble there, Andrew.
No.
I don't know whether you want to finish that sentence, Andrew. I might just
Sally,
save
Sally, I want to finish the sentence on this line alone.
At your
which
peril.
Which is that these are the kind of jobs which I think ought to be more family friendly, but they are not family friendly. They are terribly destructive jobs.
Being Prime Minister, I'd say, is not very family friendly either. I think there's something specific to the Boise newspaper culture and media culture. I mean, there are plenty of unfriendly family jobs in this country. Most of the women in this audience probably doing them. Why it doesn't explain to me why the media would be so bereft.
I'd make this point through my life in advertising and the media. Two of the most influential, powerful people that changed the lives of a lot of people in here. One lady was called Dulcie Bowling, and another one called Ida Buttrose. Now, you just think of the power of what they did. It might be that Andrew has a point, to be fair. I mean, 11 o'clock at night, and because it was Ida who told me that the most organised people in the world have to be magazine editors, and women generally who in the workforce, because they're the ones who have to have it finished by 5:10 of the night time. They have to be on the bus, they have to feed the kids, they have to do that and be back the next day. And it's true in my life. I look at our place, I looked at our last Christmas party, I looked around, there were 600 people here, I can tell you this. The majority of them are under 40, more than 50% were women, and probably 20% were Asian, but 100% were smart. And if I didn't have a balance like that, I wouldn't be able to beat the people. I think probably Andrew has a point. Over the time, the blokey culture of the deadline at 10 and 9, it was a bit tough for them, having kids like that. I hope Australia grows up, because if we don't get the balance right with women around the world, especially as we move more into Asia, where it's a little more understood in some parts. I mean, when I looked at our share register and found Mrs. Lee in Singapore had got onto the fact we run a pretty good company, I thought, and she's 80 years old as a woman, very strong, I thought that was something.
And the other thing is being in the digital play. I mean, for example, our office hours are much more sort of, we're there 8 in the morning, we leave at 6 or whatever. So, we have a completely different workforce there.
Well, Paul, I'd like a response from you if you've got anything to add. I'd love it if you did.
Well, I'd make a few observations. I mean, I think you've seen an increasing feminisation of journalism in my time in the industry. I look at the press gallery. When I first started in the press gallery in 1971, there were very, very few women. I'll look at the gallery today, and there would be a lot of women, 40, 50% at a guess. So that tells you a lot about the way the industry's changed, and I can think of the enormously competent female journalists that I've dealt with in my time in the industry. Now, you're talking about power, you're talking about the top jobs. Well, the way it sort of worked out, as Harold indicated, you had a lot of women editing magazines. That was a natural transition for them. The hours involved in editing, as Andrew says, are crippling. And it's not surprising that men tended to dominate in those editing jobs. I mean, if you were a newspaper editor in the 70s, 80s or 90s, the hours you put in were just destroying.
How many hours would you put in, Paul, when you were editing?
A lot.
Well, I'd get up at 7 a.m. at home, and you'd start monitoring the media. I'd be at the office at 9:30. I would leave the office between 9:30 and 10:30 at night, and sometimes I'd have dinner after that, often getting home at 11:30 or midnight.
And you'd call back into the office?
Well, you'd call back into the office from the restaurant.
No, we're not going to go on about
I'm not
it here,
suggesting that
about the hard hours, because I don't think...
But I mean, I'm answering the question now. I think the industry is changing, and as we see the digital impact come through in the industry, then the sort of hours I'm talking about is not going to be the norm. That will change, although when I look at what's happening, the people who run papers are still putting in enormous hours. So it's a difficult management exercise in terms of, to use the old cliche, work and family balance. It's enormously difficult.
Perhaps not something Gina Rinehart, as the sole attempt at power, has got particularly
hasn't got a family, doesn't want one.
done. Yeah. All right, we better move on to questions. Very, very interesting. If you've got a microphone, please talk.
Good.
My question's for Andrew Jaspan. What is your view of the Finkelstein report? Do you agree with the rest of the panel on that?
Look, I agree with, in a sense, what both these gentlemen said, which is it's come about. You need to really understand why it's come about, and it's really a product of, if you like, a breakdown of relations between government and the media, and the government blaming the media, and the media likewise blaming the government of the day. So I think it's unfortunate the way it's come about. But Paul, you said that, I think you said, if I've got this right, that we don't want the government interfering in the media. Now, the fact is the government doesn't interfere directly in the media, but through the independent regulator, ACMA, it actually has a regulatory body that looks over all broadcasting. So all broadcasting is regulated to ensure that it complies with certain basic standards. And my view is that, and this is being looked at in the UK right now, because there has been a real breakdown of the media there in terms of trust towards certain outlets. Now that has led to the abolition of voluntary bodies and will probably lead to the introduction of something along the lines of a regulatory framework to ensure that the media does not fall afoul of the kind of practices that we've seen, and we're talking here about illegal practices like phone hacking, etc. Now, the fact of the matter is the two are kind of linked because I think the certain politicians in this country looked at what was going on there and thought we should have a similar discussion in this country. So I think, I do. The short answer is that I think there needs to be a standards body. I'm not sure if the current press council should have its powers increased or whether there should be a new organisation. What I don't like is the fact that it will always be seen, if something is set up, as being the product of a breakdown in relations between one party, two parties really, the Labour Party and the Green Party, and the media.
Thanks. Sorry, brief question. I guess, could you take a more worldview? Because I pay for the New York Times, I pay for the Wall Street Journal, I read The Guardian, I read The Conversation, I pay for Crikey, Haaretz, and I don't see anything in The Age or The Australian that interests me at all that I'd pay for. Exactly. And I'm curious if Harold, for example, sees advertising to Australians through those global brands rather than the local stuff we get foisted on us now.
Oh, sorry for me. I agree entirely. I do exactly the same thing, and this is the great change that is taking place. That the world has simply become smaller, and as I said before, it's a great transitional change because right now our people are as likely to 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, a little like Paul has said, 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, I've got a girl who's lady who's in our Sydney office would have read everything around the world, and I don't bother getting a summary of it. I just ring up and say, tell me if there's anything that really mattered. And so that's what the world is now. In a minute or so, I suppose I'll be looking at something that's happening in the UK or somewhere else. And so that's the big change that's happening. And our kids that are growing up, they know that backwards because they're the ones who've got hold of their computers and their internet, and this is the big change that's taking place. We're not competing here with the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Sun or things like that. We're competing with the rest of the world, and that's the big thing. Our advertising right now, as I said before, one of the biggest things that we do is Google, and that's where advertisers are because that's the biggest thing that's happening. And there's another argument raging about Google, that they take an income here of $1 billion a year. Well, any television network would like to see that, I can tell you. $1 billion a year, and they pay tax, I don't know, I think Andrew would probably know, $3,000 or something. We get the bills from Ireland, and so presumably there's something going on in Ireland we don't know about.
And they take everybody's content for free.
Yeah, another argument for another night.
How do you do? My name's Andrew. Just a question about content. I've been to a lot of debates and forums about the future of the media, and people seem to be skipping over the fact that the content, many of the styles of journalism and presentation of information perhaps haven't changed a lot, but are now being, a lot of different forms are being explored on the internet. And I wondered, a question for Harold perhaps, how much he's noticed that his ads are now going alongside completely different forms of information presentation, different forms of image presentation.
And our great challenge of all of our people is to make sure that our ads match what the people want. So often they're not ads, of course, as you well know. It's other ways of simply getting information out, and so that's changing just dramatically. The great big 90-second television commercial that Mojo produced that cost $2 million or something, that just doesn't happen anymore. There'll be a quick little something in other ways and whatever it might be. So but the other thing about content and what it is that that impresses people, sometimes we can overthink all of that. I can say that I might do something on television one night and I'm very impressed with it, so I'll ring my 91-year-old dad and I said, "You see me?" He said, "Yeah, I saw you, son, your tie wasn't straight." I said, "Oh, sorry about that." But the tie, and so I looked up the research. 85% of the impression of what goes on is what you got on. 10% is the manner of how you spoke, and 5% is what you said. So I haven't got too impressed with content, I've got to tell you. It's all about what's around it.
I was just going to add one quick question.
You haven't got a time, by the way.
One more question from the audience.
Just very quickly, I just want to say that question about content is really important because we've all said that we can read the New York Times or whatever else in the morning. That really throws a much more important question back to say, well, what is it that our local media should be doing that the New York Times can't do? And that's really the important debate. And the other thing is that we have aggregators now. I mean, I don't know who uses Twitter out here, but I quite often find out interesting things from Twitter. So I'm not even reading a newspaper or an online site. I just get told you should have a look at this. Now, Twitter's only 2 years old, and this is really new. Something else will come along. This is, as I don't know, I think we're all saying, a time of really profound, radical transformation of the way we consume media and also the way in which we're going to have to produce, content into the future. It's an exciting time. I find it exciting anyway.
One more question.
Thank you. In contrast to the federal government, how does the panel, and perhaps Paul in particular, rate the opposition? Is Tony Abbott and his cohorts selling their message any better? And if so, how?
Oh, well, that's a straight political question. Well, the answer is yes, they are selling their message better. One's only got to look at the public opinion polls to see that.
Does he work the media better, though, in that way you were talking about before?
Well, his technique is to go straight to the people as much as possible. Often that is talking over the heads of the media. I think that he is probably suspicious of quite a lot of traditional media. But Abbott is very crafty. Abbott is a volunteer. Abbott comes from the local fire brigade, from the surf life-saving movement. That's his foundation. He is very much, he's got a natural affinity with the way people think. And this is really fundamental to understanding his success. So he is particularly acute at reading the public mood, reading trends in the public mood, and then thinking through how he talks to the people. And I think in that sense he is much more successful than his Labor counterparts. Kevin Rudd was in many ways a very successful leader for a short period of time. We thought initially he knew how to talk to the people, but we realised after a while that he didn't. So I think one of the points to make about Abbott is continually underestimated, particularly by the Labor Party.
I wouldn't mind just adding, if I may, what I think Abbott has done, and has done this very successfully, is to essentially have about 3 or 4 key messages and to repeat them as often as he can.
True.
Those messages are: stop the boats, the government is incompetent, it's led by a dishonest woman who lied, and there's a couple more. And if you walk around, as you know, Paul, if you walk around Parliament, these messages are pinned up. You know, everywhere you go around Liberal Party members, you'll see outside the room, they've got those messages pinned up. It's 5 messages, and you just repeat them over and over. Now, that's very effective. It really is effective because it's simple. The problem with Labour's message is it's complex. You know, the boat people issue is not just stop the boats. You know, that's a very simplistic answer. And it sums up a lot, but it's a very evocative message which you just push out. This government and other governments to follow will always find things like the refugee issue to be hugely complex, multifaceted, and that message doesn't play as well in the media, because the media are looking for, and here I exaggerate somewhat, simple bites of information that will make a headline and will make a 30-second bite. So and I totally agree with you, by the way, Paul. He is a clever guy. He's worked this through. You don't come to this by accident. He's actually worked it through. It's been market tested. And the other thing is, a lot of the media, and particularly a lot of talkback, actually like that message as well. So it has actually got much more of an audience or a following or support than potentially, you know, the complexity of other messages. And that's, I think, why he's doing so well, and the polls are reflecting that.
I'd just like to add one point, though, about Labor. Labor's key problem is that it's changed its main policies. Came in supporting a climate change action, then it retreated, then it said no carbon tax. Now it's legislated a carbon tax all over the place on boats. It came in, softened the policy, found that didn't work, then toughened the policy. It came in on fiscal policy. Rudd said he was a fiscal conservative. He then does the 3rd biggest fiscal stimulus in the developed world as a result of the global financial crisis, and the message now is they're conservatives again, we've got to get back to a substantial surplus. I could go on and on. They've changed policies all over the place.
I'm going to have to stop, because we've already gone over time. I think we could all go and have a cup of tea and come back in 5 minutes and have another hour of the Fifth Estate on Australian political culture with Paul Kelly and Andrew Jaspan and Harold Mitchell would be fantastic, but I am going to have to wind it up. I should say, since Harold, you did bring her up before, that Ida Buttrose will be the guest at this forum in 4 weeks from today. So I will put to her some of those responses. And in 2 weeks' time, we've got Satyajit Das and Andrew Charlton talking about economic growth in Australia as well. It has been an enlightening conversation, and we are very grateful for your time. Can everybody please thank Paul Kelly, Andrew Jaspan and Harold Mitchell. And thank you all for coming as well. Have a lovely night.